When we moved into that house, everything seemed perfect. It was a quiet street with well-kept gardens, kids playing on the sidewalks, and a comforting silence at night. The kind of place where you imagine spending decades without worrying about anything more than the sound of lawnmowers on Sundays. Our house was semi-detached, sharing a wall with the neighbor next door, an elderly man named Mr. Caldwell. He rarely left his house. Sometimes we'd see him peeking through the curtains or watering some wilted plants in his small front yard. At first, we thought he was just another lonely old man, someone who probably valued his privacy. But after a few weeks, we started noticing strange things. Always around 2 or 3 in the morning, we'd hear faint noises coming from the basement. It was something between spaced-out thuds and a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the concrete floor. At first, I tried to ignore it. Old houses make strange noises, right? But the sounds continued, and their frequency increased. My wife started waking up in the middle of the night, clutching my arm and asking if I could hear it too. What really began to unsettle us was the smell. A strong, sickening odor started seeping from the basement. Something rotten, almost chemical. We tried everything, ventilation, cleaning products, but nothing worked. One night, determined to end this paranoia, I decided to go down to the basement and investigate. The light was dim, and the smell felt stronger down there, like it was soaked into the walls. I walked to the spot where the sound seemed loudest, the wall we shared with Mr. Caldwell's basement. It was an old concrete wall, cracked and worn, but something caught my attention. There were irregular cracks and a fine line of concrete dust on the floor, as if someone had tampered with it recently. I pressed my ear to the wall, and for a few seconds, I heard something faint, almost like breathing. I left faster than I'd like to admit, locking the basement door behind me. The next day, we decided we couldn't ignore it anymore. We went over to Mr. Caldwell's house to talk. He opened the door just enough to look at us, his sunken eyes dull and his pale skin almost translucent. I politely asked about the noises and the smell, but he only mumbled something about old plumbing before shutting the door in our faces. My wife suggested we call the police, but I hesitated. After all, what exactly would we tell them? That our elderly neighbor was creepy and his basement smelled bad? However, that same night, the smell became so unbearable that we had no choice. We called the authorities. When the police arrived, they noticed the smell as soon as they stepped into the basement. One of the officers tapped on the shared concrete wall with a flashlight, and the sound was hollow, as if there was empty space on the other side. After several attempts, they secured a warrant to enter Mr. Caldwell's house and investigate. We stood in our backyard, watching as the officers went through the front door. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then we heard someone scream from inside, a short sound, but filled with terror. Later, we were informed about what they had found. There was an entire section of his basement that had been sealed with concrete, but it had been partially reopened, likely by him. Inside that space, the police found human remains, not just one body, but several. Some had been there so long that identification was impossible, while others appeared more recent. Among the belongings recovered were clothes, jewelry, and small personal items. The most disturbing detail, however, was that some of the bodies had been arranged ritualistically, with their hands crossed over their chests and small candles placed around them. Mr. Caldwell was taken into custody, but he seemed completely disconnected from reality, muttering incoherently as he was escorted out. The smell finally started to fade days later when cleanup crews worked tirelessly to clear everything out. But the trauma of that discovery lingered. Every time we go down to our basement now, we feel a sense of oppression, as if something from that place has seeped into the walls. We later discovered that Mr. Caldwell had been investigated decades earlier, suspected of being connected to disappearances in the area. However, he was never arrested due to a lack of evidence. He had lived in that house for years, hiding his secrets just feet away from where we slept every night. The police believe he may have continued his horrific acts up until shortly before his arrest. We considered moving, but the real estate market isn't kind to houses with stories like this. So we stayed, trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy. But every night, when silence takes over, it still feels like we can hear something. A distant echo, like faint thuds and a dragging sound. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me or something that never truly left. The snowstorm started earlier than expected, covering the road in a thick, treacherous layer of snow within minutes. After hours of driving with barely any visibility and my fingers nearly frozen to the steering wheel, I spotted a worn-out sign for a roadside motel. Moonlight Motel, it said in flickering, faded letters. It wasn't my first choice, but with the weather worsening, I had no other option. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for 2 cars blanketed in snow. I stepped into the reception area, where a broken bell failed to make a sound when I tapped on the counter. The manager appeared out of nowhere, a short man with a wrinkled face and a smile far too fake to be comforting. "Room 207, he said, handing me an old-fashioned key, the kind nobody uses anymore. The room was just as bad as I'd expected. Peeling wallpaper, a musty smell clinging to the carpet, and the constant sound of the wind rattling against the window. But at least it was warm. On the first night, I tried to ignore the noises. The groaning heater, the dripping faucet in the bathroom, and the occasional sound of something scratching inside the walls. I was sure it was just rats. The next day, I asked the manager if there were other guests, but he just shook his head and said, "It's the off-season, just you here." Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. On the second night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was muffled, almost like whispered voices, but it was coming from beneath the floor, directly under my room. I froze, trying to figure out if it was my imagination or if someone was actually down there. The voices were unintelligible but urgent, like they were discussing something or maybe pleading. I realized I wouldn't be able to go back to sleep without answers. I threw on a coat, walked down to the reception desk, and found the manager reading an old newspaper. "Is there someone downstairs?" I asked. He looked at me with that frozen smile. "We don't have a basement here, ma'am. Must just be the wind." The way he said it, so quick and rehearsed, made my skin crawl. I knew he was lying. After he disappeared into his office, I decided to investigate on my own. The hallway was silent, except for the faint whistle of the wind sneaking through the window cracks. At the far end of the corridor, I noticed the door to the laundry room. It was a small space, with outdated machines and baskets piled on top of each other. And there, behind a shifted washing machine, I spotted something. A trapdoor on the floor, half hidden under a dirty tarp. My heart started pounding as I crouched down to pull the tarp away. There was a rusted metal handle, and when I tugged it open, the trapdoor groaned loudly, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. A wave of cold air rose from the opening, carrying with it a strange smell, metallic, damp, and undeniably wrong. I illuminated the steps with my phone's flashlight and began descending, one step at a time, trying to control my breathing. The space below was claustrophobic, with damp brick walls and exposed pipes. The cracked concrete floor was stained with dark marks I didn't want to identify. As I walked through that narrow corridor, I started hearing the voices again. They were clearer now, almost like muffled groans. Ahead, I spotted a slightly ajar metal door, with the faint flicker of a fluorescent light bleeding through the gap. I pushed the door open slowly, and what I saw made my stomach turn. It was an improvised operating room, with an old surgical table in the center, stained with something dark. Tools, saws, scalpels, pliers were scattered across a metal bench, all rusted and filthy. The walls were covered with photos of people. Terrified faces, some blurred, others with their eyes covered by duct tape. One detail froze me in place. One of the photos was of me. I was standing next to my car, taken at the moment I had arrived at the motel. Trembling, I stepped back and nearly fell when I heard something behind me. The sound of footsteps dragging across the concrete. I spun around and saw a silhouette at the end of the hallway. It was the manager, standing there, his smile now twisted into something monstrous. He held something in his hand, a metallic object that glinted faintly under the dim light. "You shouldn't be down here," he muttered, his voice echoing through the confined space. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs felt frozen. When I finally managed to move, I turned and bolted down the corridor, racing back up the staircase. I stumbled on the steps, the sound of his heavy footsteps reverberating behind me. When I reached the laundry room, I slammed the trapdoor shut, dragged the washing machine back over it, and sprinted to my room. I locked the door, shoved the dresser against it, and dialed the police with trembling hands. As I waited, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway, stopping right outside my door. Slow, deliberate breathing followed, and then silence. When the police finally arrived, the manager was gone, and the basement was empty. All that remained were rusted tools and dark stains on the floor. The police shut down the motel that night. They found evidence of disappearances going back decades. But the manager, or whoever he was never found. Months later, I still wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of dragging footsteps on concrete. And that damp, metallic smell seems to linger in my dreams. I should have trusted my gut and left on the first night. But now, all I'm left with is the certainty that I will never again trust a roadside motel. Working as a night security guard in a corporate building was never the most exciting job in the world, but it had also never been something that made me nervous. My routine was simple. Regular patrols across the floors, monitoring security cameras, and filling out reports no one would probably ever read. But over the past few weeks, I started noticing strange things. Small details that seemed insignificant at first. A chair slightly pulled away from a desk, an empty coffee cup left in a hallway corner, papers slightly out of place. During the day, these things might have gone unnoticed amidst the chaos of employees coming and going. But at night, in the absolute silence of an empty building, these details screamed for attention. First, I tried to ignore it. Maybe an employee had stayed late and rushed out, leaving a mess behind. But night after night, the signs piled up. A snack wrapper tucked under a desk, greasy fingerprints on a computer screen that clearly hadn't been used in days. Something wasn't right. So I started paying closer attention to the cameras. The footage was always the same. Empty hallways, faintly flickering emergency lights, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something about the way the shadows moved or how certain spots seemed darker than they should have been that made me uneasy. That's when I decided I needed to investigate the lower floors, the ones under renovation and supposedly empty. Descending to the renovation floors felt like stepping into another world. The silence was thicker there, almost tangible. Dust covered the floor, tools were scattered here and there, and transparent plastic sheets hung across parts of the walls. The lighting was sparse, with temporary bulbs casting distorted shadows from the ceiling. As I walked cautiously down the main hallway, I noticed something: fresh footprints in the dust. They weren't mine, and they weren't heavy boot prints from construction workers. They were light, deliberate, like someone was trying not to make any noise. My heart started to race. I followed the footprints down the corridor until they led to a room at the back, one of the few with a closed door. When I opened the door, I froze. The room was partially furnished with things that clearly didn't belong on a construction site. A thin mattress lay on the floor, covered with dirty blankets. A backpack sat open with crumpled clothes spilling out. There were half-eaten food containers, half-empty water bottles, and, most disturbingly, printed photos pinned to the wall. Photos of the upper floors, photos of employees working. Some seemed to have been taken through windows or from slightly ajar doors. Scribbled notes surrounded the images. Names, times, small observations like, arrives at 8 a.m. every day, or alone in the office from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. My stomach turned as I realized this wasn't just someone looking for shelter. This person had been watching. My first instinct was to back away, return to my security room, and call the police. But before I could move, I heard something behind me. A faint dragging sound, almost imperceptible, like someone shifting in the shadows. I froze, my heart beat so loud I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, I turned around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. In the darkest corner of the room, a shadow shifted. I couldn't make out a face, just the silhouette of someone crouched low, almost blending into the darkness. For a brief moment, I felt like that person was studying me, evaluating whether I was a threat or just another target. Without thinking twice, I took 2 steps back and bolted. I didn't look behind me. I didn't want to know if I was being followed. When I reached the security room, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and took a deep breath before grabbing the phone to call the police. While waiting, I stared at the monitors, scanning every feed. That's when I saw something that froze me in place. On one of the cameras showing the lower floor hallway, I saw a shadow moving slowly toward the emergency exit. Whoever it was, they were leaving. The police arrived in less than 15 minutes, but the intruder was long gone. They found the same things I had: mattress, photos, notes, but no trace of the person who had been there. The official investigation revealed that the person had likely been in the building for weeks, maybe even months. Someone who knew how to avoid cameras, how to hide at the right times. But the most disturbing part came later. One of the notes on the wall read, "The night guard knows too much." That meant at some point this person had realized I was paying attention. Maybe it was the nights I stared at the cameras a little too long, or when I lingered on certain floors during my rounds. I don't know. They reinforced security, installed more cameras, and sealed off the lower floors. But that didn't erase what I felt that night. Sometimes, as I make my rounds, I still feel like I'm being watched, as if somehow that person never really left. Or worse, as if they're just waiting for the right moment to come back.